From 2005 until 2011, you're the CEO of Aegon UK. I want to ask you about the period around sort of 2004, 5, 6 when the Turner Commission publishing its second report. There's a lot of debate in the industry. What was your perspective running Aegon at that time on those reforms?
Okay, well, I think you have to start with understanding what the industry had been through before then. And there's probably two parts to that. The first part would be our view, and I'll talk as the industry as much as the CEO of Aegon, because I don't think at that point there were one or two outliers, I would say, in terms of industry participants who had quite a different view from the industry as a whole, but predominantly people were quite clustered together in terms of their views on this stuff. We had seen in the years before, particularly the stakeholder pensions initiative, which had been an attempt to try and change the way the pensions market worked for people, but almost flying in the face of anyone who had an understanding of how the market was working at that point, and in particular the importance of the intermediary and the role of the intermediary at that point. So the constraints that were applied through the stakeholder pensions world meant that it was never going to really move the way government, as we understood it, wanted it to move. It had the impact of changing pricing, because typically the pricing that had been normal in the market before stakeholder pensions came in would have been probably to the order of 2% per annum, or maybe even more. What stakeholder did, through the combination of the pricing of a stakeholder product and the regulatory perspective on where it should fit in the choices that were offered to customers, had the effect of moving pricing towards the 150 basis points originally, and then to 100 basis points. So we'd seen a pricing impact, but we knew that the proportion of the market the stakeholder would be was always going to be quite small. So there was a certain amount of scepticism about whether Turner and anything that would flow from Turner would be any different. The second point, I think, was that this was an industry which had many of the following winds that had driven its business success gradually removed. So it was around that time that the mortgage market, where the norm had been that you repaid your mortgage using an endowment policy, that was beginning to move. The tax advantages that were available in other savings vehicles that life companies offered had been chipped away and limited and removed. The bull market was starting to run out of steam. I mean, there were many aspects about the business environment which were becoming more challenging. And the intermediary sector, on which the market had largely depended for access to customers, was itself having challenges thrown at it. So it was an industry which you would say was pretty embattled and defensive about new developments, but also sceptical about the ability of government to really intervene in a way that would change anything very much. So we were sitting there looking at what was coming out of Turner with quite a bit of scepticism and with a fairly defensive posture at that point.
I mean, you talked about the industry and the circumstances it faced at that time. Things that Turner was saying that were inevitable about change happening. Did you begin to concur with that?
Well, I think the analysis was accepted. I have to say the Turner work, the Commission's reports and the output were extremely well regarded by the industry. It was well founded, well built. The analysis was very strong. The challenge of an ageing population and the decline of the defined benefits pension sector was well understood and recognised. I think where there were differences of opinion was around the territory of how best to try and square this circle, how to try and address the issue that Turner had absolutely clearly identified. I think there was a belief in the industry that the government would stop short of compulsion, because the link between compulsory saving and effectively taxation seemed very strong and politically dangerous and risky.
So your assessment was that compulsion wouldn't happen, despite people advocating for it. It wouldn't happen because it would look too much like a tax.
It certainly wouldn't happen right away. I mean, I think everybody understood that whatever the first step was, there might be a second step and a third step. But it was, and I mean, I'm boiling down, learned papers that were written by many people and discussed by many people about what could happen and what might not happen. But I think the consensus view was that compulsion would be too far. The idea of soft compulsion, I don't think was as well understood as perhaps it should have been. So the idea that you would compel the employer to set something up, and that effectively through the inertia and behavioural economics, behavioural finance, people would be brought into saving without even noticing, I don't think that was fully understood by the industry. And that was, I think, because fully understood or accepted by the industry. I think that was because most of us had grown up in a world where this thing about a product having to be sold rather than bought, that the intermediary's role in advising and persuading was critical to making people effectively defer the gratification that comes with having money to spend. So you're tying money up in something that eventually you'll get your hands on, but who knows when, that wasn't going to change anytime soon. So the idea that you could just kind of create something and it would suddenly transform the way a market worked, we were quite sceptical about. The potential that offered, though, to bring down distribution costs and to make the market work more efficiently was understood, but I think there was just a bit of scepticism about how effective it would be. In any case, the sense was, well, actually, government isn't going to invest hundreds of millions of pounds in creating a solution to serve this market in a different way. Surely they can be persuaded that the answer lies in the industry coming together in some way, using our existing infrastructure, which had been developed over decades, to deploy into this market more cheaply and at lower risk to government to achieve their ends. So there was a kind of series of pieces of analysis here, some of which were about how likely it was that it would happen, some of which were about how effective will it be even if it does happen, and then finally, well, if it does happen, why wouldn't they use us as the mechanism to deliver it? Some of the nervousness around the impact this could have on what had been our conventional territory was fairly low, but there was certainly an argument to be won. I mean, the other point, of course, that one mustn't forget, and it's quite easy to forget with the passage of time, was just how much conduct regulation challenge there was in the industry. There was pensions mis-selling, there was a history of endowment mortgage challenges starting to come through. The industry's reputation was at a very low ebb. And I'm sure that we underestimated just how low it was.
Is it your view that the sort of politicians leveraged that to press change?
I think it depends which end of the telescope you're looking at it from. As we looked at it from our position, we did not see that as something government would leverage. What we saw it as is something that would make it less palatable for government to accept that we could be the answer. And so we had to persuade them that we could change and that the practices of the past were not representative of the way the industry could be in the future. And I think to a certain extent there was consensus around the industry that argument could be won and should be won. And of course there were things happening in the industry to address the reputational stuff anyway, because it wasn't an industry that was in denial, it was an industry that acknowledged and accepted it had to change. But I think the view was that on balance the argument could be won. I think one of the sticking points though was price. The industry had convinced itself that this product could not be delivered economically anywhere around 50 basis points or below. And if I remember rightly, when Turner was talking about price originally, I think he was down at 30 basis points. And we laughed at the idea that 30 basis points could work, apart from one player in particular, Legal & General, who quite strongly put themselves on the side of, yes, this can be done. And 30 basis points is feasible.
Why do you think they said that?
Well, that's a very good question. I think some of that was about their business model. I mean, L&G had been early into tracker funds. They were already delivering simple investment solutions at a very low cost. They had confidence in their technology, I would guess. They probably felt that even if they were to position themselves, well, if they positioned themselves out there, then there was every chance that they could be influential in shaping the way the policy landed. And if it landed the right way, they could end up benefiting from it, either very, very significantly or just significantly. So, I mean, self-interest in a number of different ways, or shareholder interest, or it's actually going to be good for the customer as well. I wasn't there, so I don't know. But it would be some combination of those. There was a work group, which I think I participated in, if I can remember far enough back, that actually was generating ideas about how the industry could participate in this change and what models we could support. So the whole thing around the carousel model, which you may have heard of from others, where there would be a kind of number of providers who were willing to participate on terms that were set by the law, and that effectively when it was your turn, you would be taken out of the carousel and you would be the answer for company A or company B or company C. That was a product of the ABI collaboration. And there would have been other models too. I think though there were definitely questions about scalability, to what extent is this going to generate significant peaks of activity? And there was, of course, a dawning concern around what impact this would have on the historic business that had been written, because many of the players who were involved in these discussions were players who had been very active and very large market share controllers of what had been the group defined contribution market before. And if you move to a new model with new pricing and different value parameters, clearly the concern was, well, we're going to see a mass migration of assets from the margin generating business we've written historically, which had costs associated, which the industry had actually incurred, into this new model where the whole game's different, and the economics of that could be very value destroying from the shareholder point of view. So that was clearly in the background of all these discussions.
Your engagement with Turner as an industry and with the politicians making decisions on Turner was largely channeled through the ABI. One of the things, of course, about the Turner Commission was that it was, very consciously saying everybody has to give something for this to move forward. Were you conscious of that as well as an industry, that there were other players and you all had to move to get to the right kind of solution?
Yes, and I think it would be wrong to characterise the industry as intransigent and inward-looking, and we just let this pass. This is not something we need to engage with. There was an acceptance of the need for change. I'd already talked about the fact that on the broad range of reputational issues, there was progress already underway to try and reposition the industry as far more customer-focused and far more transparent. And I think there was also an acknowledgement that a model that was being described the way Turner looked like he was going to shape this, with some form of compulsion, albeit not compulsion on the individual saver, but compulsion on the employer, would bring economies of scale in terms of delivery of this and provision of this, and that had to be reflected in a very different pricing structure. There was also an acknowledgement that the product design and the approach to communication and all the rest would have to be different. But I think there was a belief in the industry that it was kind of a no-brainer that should come from within the existing infrastructure rather than building new. And of course, this becomes foggier with the passage of time. But I'm reminded, particularly in my current role, that there was a point where Nest was going to be the solution for everybody. There was not going to be participation from the industry at all. It was just going to be auto-enrolment is Nest, and Nest will do all of it. And I think that emerged quite late in the recommendations, and then of course got lobbied and negotiated out into a different model. But up to that point, there was an assumption and a certain amount of complacency that why would government choose to do anything other than use the existing infrastructure, albeit with constraints applied, which would change the economics of the business and would make demands on us in terms of what we had to deliver. But there was an assumption that we would be part of the answer.
And just on the question of the state framework. So obviously, the idea that you get more private saving is only, certainly in Turner's propositions, is only feasible if you reduce means testing. Was that something that the industry shared?
Well, I think a small part in the community, the pensions industry community, would have had thoughts about that. Let me try and explain what I mean. The individual firms who were active in the pensions market would not have had engagement with people who were on that boundary anyway. The extent to which the pensions industry, the defined contribution intermediated pensions industry, reached into people on average earnings even, was quite limited. So to go beyond that was just, what? I did a piece of work in around that time with the Treasury on generic advice, and that gave me a chance to get to know a part of the world that, as a product provider and a financial services participant, I had no contact with. So Citizens Advice Bureau and people managing debt, and a whole world was opened up to me. I mean, this sounds ridiculous now, but at the time it was the world we were in. We lived in a world where it was the mass affluent, where it was large employers who could afford to pay intermediaries for services to structure benefits for their employees, who saw those benefits as being part of the competition for labour, and so it was important to have good quality, and the investment forms had to be right and all the rest. But this was something right up here, not something that was serving the ordinary man and woman in the street on average earnings or below. That was a world for the welfare state and the state pension, and we didn't even think about that much. The people who did were the thoughtful people, and there were some around the industry, I wouldn't put myself in that category, but others who were taking a far more holistic view of what society's needs were and how these challenges were going to be addressed. But those would be the minority. Most people had been conditioned by the world in which they had built their businesses and the assumption that that was the world they would continue to engage with. So this piece, and that was part of the other reason why, whilst there was a recognition this would change things, the question really was how much will this change for the piece that we're involved with.
If you close down contracting out in order to move to a single tier as we now have it, that presumably was a concern for you at the time.
Yes, but different organisations, different ways, because depending on your business and your business mix, you might have exposure to that or you might not. And to be honest, the thing was there was a growing realisation that there was a big growth in a market here as well, and that actually you could see, I mean there was a big question about defined benefit schemes and the extent to which this would accelerate their demise, and whether the average contribution levels across the industry as a whole were going to drop rather than go up. And there was a lot of discussion about how this was a kind of dumbing down to a kind of lowest common denominator solution. But of course that was sort of in denial of the fact that was happening anyway. The contracting out thing, I think on balance people would have said, well, okay, there's a short-term hit potentially in terms of contribution revenue, but there's a simplification benefit. People will know where they stand in terms of their state pension, and to a large extent that makes the narrative around why it's important to add to that more compelling and more easy for people to engage with. And it was an industry at the time which was able to take a long-term view. You know, the way accounting worked, the way capital provision worked, you were able to spread your initial costs over the lifetime of the contract. So it's a bit like, you know, building big 747s or whatever. You know, the pricing basis, the basis of which you account for earnings, it's quite dense and quite difficult to understand. And that was all going on in this market too. Now, things have simplified. You know, accounting rules have made it easier for investors to look through to where are the genuine profits emerging. You know, you fast forward to now, and a lot of that transparency means that those accounting principles and practices, which seemed quite arcane, won't work anymore. But that environment, understanding that environment, is quite important if you're going to understand why organisations were reacting in the way they were.
So, 2011, you've taken over at the ABI. You've got a change of government. How important was it to you at the ABI and prior to that to secure political consensus, or to maintain the consensus that appeared to have been achieved?
Well, and it had been achieved. I mean, I think the interesting thing about that period was, you know, a lot of things have happened. So the detail about how this is going to work in practice has become clear. The role of Nest, for example, has become clear. The fact that the industry can participate if they meet certain criteria has become clear also. We've moved through that phase of kind of trying to have a battle where you win the whole prize. You know, there's an acceptance that this is actually something where you're going to end up with a sharing of responsibilities, but actually one that's worked out pretty well, because Nest is seen by the industry as something that's going to pick up the bottom end of this and not migrate very far into the more conventional territory that the industry inhabited. So that's the environment within which we're operating. So the industry is seeing this largely now as a positive development rather than as a threat. It's also probably getting more of the social policy purpose behind this. Took a while, but it got there in the end. And I think some of that was this reorientation towards the customer and away from the intermediary. The relationship in the past had always been focused on the intermediary, and the end customer had been somewhat secondary. This world was changing for the industry, and it was getting its head straight on where it needed to focus. But to your point on political consensus, it was a genuine consensus. I mean, I still think it's one of the most remarkable things that consensus was formed in the first place and has largely been retained. I mean, there's a little bit of fraying at the edges, but nothing significant. And for me, I'm just really pleased that I've been allowed to live through that. In the context of today and what we're seeing in some other areas, it's kind of reassuring that this model can work. Democracy may have a future, but it did work well. And I think the industry by that time had worked out that its narrative had to be about the policy as well as the industry's part in it. So getting behind the importance of maintaining progress towards the goal, there were moments, and I can't remember exactly when these happened chronologically, but there were moments when decisions were taken to slow things and to delay things, and that the original deadlines were pushed back, and then there was discussion about contribution levels and whether those should be phased over a longer period, and there's been a big argument running, I think it's over, about how far into the SME and micro market in terms of employers this thing should go. Should anybody under employee levels of 50 or whatever be exempt from this? There was a political challenge from a part of the Tory party, if I remember rightly, at one point. But the consensus managed to hold to repel any of those challenges. And I think the industry's view was it could have been worse. We could have been excluded from this totally. We haven't been. The pricing looked ridiculous, but actually it's turned out to be something we can accommodate because of the economics of scale and the technology, of course, which we tend to forget technology hasn't always been able to do what it's able to do now. So if you go back to the early part of the century, you had old legacy systems that ran on mainframes and they weren't able to do the tricks that they can do now. You go forward to 2010, 2011, and technology is starting to reduce the costs of delivery of a lot of these pieces very, very significantly indeed. So the economics catch up, the cost of manufacture catches up with the policy aspiration of Turner, and you end up with a kind of consensus around that too. So I suppose the point I'm making is the industry had a motive to maintain the consensus. If they'd seen aspects of this which just weren't working for them, I don't know what would have happened because it wasn't the case. But I've seen the industry in other circumstances adopt a different position. On this one, it suited them, it was working, it had a positive future ahead of it, and the social policy challenge perhaps was going to be, at least if not fully addressed, partially addressed. So there was an incentive to maintain the consensus.
And so Turner in that regard then appears that it supplied, if you like, a kind of a set of ideas, a way of thinking about a broader public interest that the industry could find its shareholder private interest within.
It did. No, it did. Yeah. It did. And of course, the important ingredient in this, and I'm not just saying this because I'm the chairman of the organisation, Nest was a really important piece in this, because what Nest did was signal that there would be available an alternative at the price point that had been determined by government to deliver to the people who hadn't been served by the industry before. And if you go back to what I was saying right at the start about stakeholder and the impact stakeholder had on pricing, it had an impact on pricing because the regulator said, you as an advisor have to consider the stakeholder alternative because there is a price advantage there, and if you're going to go with something more expensive, you've got to be able to justify why. Nest effectively did the same thing in the auto enrolment market. So the availability of a product priced at 50 basis points changed the market overnight. And of course the result has been pricing at levels that nobody would have ever imagined the industry could deliver. But at the point we're talking about, when the change of government came through, there was no suggestion that the industry would do anything other than continue to put its shoulders behind maintaining that consensus and being part of that consensus.
Can you say a bit more about why you think Nest has kind of been able to become a kind of established part of the landscape?
Well, I think, and again, I'd say a little bit about what the industry thought of Nest, because the industry was convinced that Nest was going to fail, that if it did succeed, it would only be a partial success. So it would end up being a kind of a grey alternative to the vibrant, exciting, innovative offerings that the industry, with all their years of experience, could deliver. And that whilst it would exist and whilst it would be there, nobody would choose, if they had a choice, to go to Nest because it was such a, government-supported piece. Now, it didn't turn out that way. That's the thing. One of the reasons Nest succeeded was because actually for its customer, and by that I mean the employer as well as the member of the scheme, the employee of the company who's saving with us, it was designed in a way that actually worked for them. Because the most significant proportion of Nest's membership are savers, they're not investors. This is about people beginning to save regularly who've never saved regularly before. And the industry was still orientating itself towards a community of people who either had experience of investing or were employed by companies who certainly had experience of setting up benefit schemes for their employees. So the industry continued to operate in a model which looked like an evolution of the past. What Nest did was say, no, actually this is a whole new game we're playing here. It's a totally different market. It's going to work different ways. Behavioural finance is a key part of how it works. We're going to design solutions which work well for a new set of customers and a new set of employers who've never worked with the pensions industry before. And if you look at the way the whole piece was designed, I mean, I wasn't around then, I was watching this from the outside, it's been pretty forensically designed around what works for those two constituencies. So heavily research and evidence-based in terms of member behaviour, heavily researched and evidence-based in terms of how does an employer approach this? What are they thinking about as they think about having to set this up? Is this about meeting legal obligations, or is this about setting up a benefits package for its staff? How much of it is an employer being a good employer, and how much of it is just keeping legal and doing the minimum you have to do to be legal? And the small and micro employer community, which is a huge part of Nest's community now, had never been engaged with before successfully by the industry, and so had no real preconceptions about what good looked like. And I think one of the things that Nest did extremely well was that thinking and that planning and that delivery. Another piece, though, is the complete opposite, which is it's government backed. That the presence of government behind it gave people confidence. I was chatting to somebody only this morning, actually, who was saying to me that very thing. Why would we go anywhere else? Because we knew that this had not government guarantees, it wasn't as strong as that, but there was an assumption that government would do whatever it had to do to make this thing work. And people at that point don't go through the process of, well, just how many technology projects have government successfully managed to roll out in the last 100 years, They don't go there, they just go to the first base, which is, okay, it might not be the best and it might not be perfect, but it's got somebody behind it who I understand and know will make sure it works. And then finally, of course, I mean, there's many more aspects, but the way the regulatory regime rolled out, the employer was sent a letter by the pension regulator explaining what their responsibilities were and what their legal obligations were. And on that letter, at the bottom, it said, there are other pension companies available, but Nest is a company that's been set up by government to be easy to use, and here's the website. Now, I can't tell you how those different components work together in any one decision that any one person made, but I know that all were present. The thing that I've seen, now that I'm an insider, if you like, to Nest rather than somebody on the outside, is that actually it does work, and it did work, and it delivered on its promises. So the solutions in terms of the investment piece, the communications to the employee, to the member of the scheme, the way the systems work for employers, the ease of use of systems for employers, the learning from experience. So as more people use the system, that would be fed back in to the next release of the technology so that it would work better for those people. All those pieces together made it work for Nest. And I think the other aspect was we were a single product company. So we had no distractions. We only had one thing we were going to do, and it was pension saving for people on average earnings and around average earnings. And so there's a kind of focus that brings to every aspect of the way you do it, which the rest of the industry didn't have the luxury of. The rest of the industry was doing life protection plans and annuities and pension plans and historical stuff and regulatory stuff around general insurance. They were battling on a number of fronts, and they had a proposition which was spread across all of those, whereas Nest had one thing that it did, and it was going to do that one thing really well. And there was a consistent regulatory and legislative environment around it. Things didn't keep changing. They stayed constant through quite a significantly long period of time, which gave Nest a fighting chance of being able to deliver on its project and get the product out on time and scale up their capability when they needed it.
Let me just ask you a bit more about that, though, because Turner reported before the financial crisis. After the financial crisis, we've had a decade of stagnant wages. Ordinarily, this would not be a propitious time to be asking people to save more. So how do you think that Nest has been able to be successful in getting people to save in those circumstances?
Well, what you're doing is pointing to the other side of the coin, because participation has been significantly grown. Nest and auto-enrolment has been massively successful at getting people to participate in pension saving, but at such a low level that they don't really notice that they're doing it. Contribution levels have been so low that it's kind of in the rounding on your pay packet. There's so many other bits moving around that people don't really notice it, or if they do notice it, it's not enough to persuade them to change. Embedded in that is the whole thinking around behavioural finance, which I haven't talked about actually in terms of the success. I should have talked about in terms of the success, because there has been, some of my colleagues here who've been involved from before Nest existed can talk about this far more effectively than I can. But the understanding of what the learnings of behavioural finance were, and the designing of an approach which is with the grain of behavioural finance, right down to when do you send out the reminder letter, or what's the language you use around the wake-up pack, or the material you get when you join. How's that positioned? How do you deal with the opt-out period? All the components of the auto-enrolment system were looked at through the behavioural finance lens, and the optimal solution on the basis of the understanding, the academic understanding at the time, was built into the way the product was delivered, and the way the system was delivered, and the way the service was delivered. And that has worked. Again, the conventional industry didn't come at it that way. Rather, the industry came at it from the point of view of their own learnings from a different world, and tried to shoehorn them into the new world to try and continue on the path they were already on. And so I think the industry would have failed if it had been trying to address the market that Nest has succeeded in. And I think that it required that fresh thinking across the whole spectrum of the components of what had to be delivered to make it succeed.
So at the level of ideas, Turner puts auto-enrolment and behavioural economics sort of on the agenda, and those people then working to deliver Nest had been dealing with a set of ideas 20 years earlier, that it wouldn't have worked as well.
No, absolutely. I think who knows what would have happened, but I think what would have probably happened would have been another version of stakeholder. So where there was an employer who wanted to set up a package for his staff, and where there was an intermediary who was involved, and where there was a product provider who's willing to provide solutions at a price point that would pass whatever test it was that was being applied at that point. And of course, remember, there weren't price caps at the beginning. The price cap came in later. The 75 basis points cap on auto-enrolment schemes came in later. The thing that kept the pricing honest was the existence of Nest. So in a way, what you'd have had was Nest fulfilling a purpose by setting a price benchmark, the industry being forced to aggregate around that benchmark, but the penetration deeper into the community and the population would not have been achieved to the extent that it has. The problem, of course, is this half full, half empty argument. At the low levels of contribution that are currently the case, even with contribution levels starting to rise, we still have a big challenge ahead of us in terms of adequacy. And the disengaged nature of the savings community, who have been brought in through behavioural finance techniques, which basically mean as far as possible you don't let them touch the side, it just happens. The other side of that coin is exposed, because at some point you're going to have to make people aware of what it is they've got and the importance of maintaining it and building it. So it's one step at a time, but I've no doubt that on balance it's hugely positive. I mean, the platform that's been created is enormously positive. It's down to the industry and to legislators and others now to work out how sensibly and safely you can move things up in terms of the adequacy dimension. And there was a first test of that a year ago when the first stage of contribution increase went through, and the impact was barely discernible. I mean, we haven't seen a big change in people's savings behaviour. This one will take it up another level. I think that the expectation is that that should go through without a major disruption, but we just don't know. So
I suppose the other thing that's happened since the financial crisis has been a big increase in self-employment in the UK. Where do you think you go next with that kind of market?
It's a difficult question to answer. So there are two. I would describe two different directions of policy development. One is about the extent to which the basic model of auto-enrolment for employed people should be developed further, and that's around adequacy and where people save and how much of their salary and their income counts in terms of contributing to their savings. So there's a whole bunch of stuff going on in there. And then there's the people who aren't served at all, who the self-employed are a big part of that. There are also people, because there's a minimum income level below which you don't participate, there's a lot of people excluded. There are significant gender biases in that too, so women tend to be more excluded than men in this model. So there are some policy challenges in there which need to be addressed. But the self-employed, because they don't have an employer, provide a certain type of challenge which is different. So the delivery mechanism for this success has been the employer. If you don't have the employer, what do you do? And nobody knows is the honest answer, but some things are being tried out now. So we have a unit here at Nest which collaborates with academics across the world and also now with government on trying some things out, because Shlomo Bernatzi had one of his presentations, I remember it said, we don't know the answer, but let's find out. Let's just try things and see what works. And don't be afraid to try things. So now we're trying things. There are some projects underway to see, there are maybe 2 or 3 different ideas about how people who are self-employed could get involved in this in some way. And let's try them and see what difference it makes and how they work. There's another very interesting piece, just to kind of add a bit more colour, around the challenge of pension saving being long term. So you are going to give me some of your hard earned, and then you're not going to get your hands on it until you're at least 55 or maybe older. And why does that look like a good deal for you? Well, wouldn't it be good if that savings habit could create something that you could access? So instead of being in a position where every time the washing machine breaks down or the car's got a problem, you've got to get a loan to pay for the repairs or whatever, you've got some money which is part of this savings regime which you can tap into. So there's a thing called the sidecar. It's an idea of part of what you save being diverted to a short-term vehicle, and that's about maintaining the resilience of the savings habit. So you don't find people stopping altogether. What they can do is deal with a short-term problem, but maintain the long-term savings piece. So there are a number of these pieces. The policy needs to continue to grow and develop and be an organic thing. The problem at the moment, of course, because of the political environment, is the bandwidth within government to do much of that is very, very constrained. So the question is, when can we start again to move this thing on? Because it has to move on, because the adequacy challenge has not been addressed. The coverage issue is partial. It's significant, but it's partial. There's more to do.
Slightly related to that point is that the the relationship between Nest and the trade unions. How important is your sort of interaction, if you like, with the representatives of many of the people that you're going to be serving?
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, we get involved in engaging with anyone who has a role to play for our membership, because we have 8 million members now, 8 million savers. That's such a large part of society that we touch every part of society. So anybody that you could describe as a stakeholder who has the interests of those people that we have to maintain strong relationships with. It doesn't feel to me like it's about shaping policy. It's about explaining and understanding what's working. It's about understanding what they believe their membership needs in terms of the movement on from here. It's explaining to them what's easy to do, what's hard to do, how the current approach could be amended or evolved. I think it's really important for Nest to try and maintain its neutrality in this. The consensus was hard won, and I tend to think of the consensus in political terms, but obviously it was far broader than that, because it was the employers also and it was the unions also who all got behind this, and it was all parts of the employment community. So it was a huge thing. And for Nest to start to be seen to be taking a position or being partial, for me, undermines its power. Its power is being good at what it does and being available there for people. You know, if a government comes in with a different set of ideas about how it wants to use this asset, then that's for government. They're democratically elected. We're here to look after the members' interest, and that means running the scheme well. And I don't think running the scheme well means starting to politic for a particular set of outcomes on policy. We can inform policy development through our experience, and we do, actively. And we have a view on things, but it's not to try and influence an outcome other than one that works better for the membership.
We've had a kind of very different set of reforms in 2014, George Osborne's pension freedoms, which, you know, compared to the Turner reforms and the creation of Nest, just look much more sudden. How does that affect your landscape? Has sudden change like that?
Well, remember, I was in the ABI when it all happened. I had a real close-up view of the whole thing. A couple of comments. First is the annuity market wasn't working, and the annuity product wasn't working. And the problem there was not, as some people would characterise it, simply because the industry manipulated the system for its own ends. It wasn't. That did happen. I mean, there were aspects of practice which weren't good practice, but the issue was more about the fundamental design. The annuity had been designed at a time when people lived, if they were lucky, till they were 70. It was for people retiring with 5 years of retirement ahead of them. The longevity issue was not an issue for the annuity market when it was created. So fast forward to a point where people are potentially going to live 30 years after they buy their annuity, and you have two huge problems. First is predicting whether it's 30 years or 35 years or 25 years. And the second one is you're forcing them, because of the regulatory regime and how it constrains the capital that you have to hold, you're forcing the product provider into an investment strategy which is very, very conservative, which is essentially fixed interest and gilts for a 30-year period, which you would not do. It's not the way we manage money in the accumulation phase, so why is it right for the decumulation phase? Now, if the industry had got its act together quick enough, it would have understood that fundamental set of problems and come up with solutions which helped solve them. And actually, we wouldn't have thrown the baby out with the bathwater, which is largely what we've done in policy terms. So what you'd have ended up with was a solution where you didn't make the decision to build the guarantee in until later, that you run the retirement pot on a balanced basis with equities in it for longer, and then you buy your insurance for your really old age much, much later, and the cost of that's going to be much lower. And you build in some transparency around this so people think they understand they're getting value for money. But the industry was far too slow to understand that was the problem they were having. And what they did instead was, and I mean I was part of this, try to address the conduct issues and the regulatory issues and improve the communications, and without understanding that the fundamental design had outlived its usefulness and the world had changed. Then you build a policy where there are no constraints anymore, and then you're surprised when people start drawing cash out because they can, because they've got debts and stuff. Perfectly logical economic decision to make. I've got a debt, I'd rather not have my debt. I can get some cash here and pay that off, and I'll worry about tomorrow when it comes. But now we've got a building problem for the current generation, which is all about people's awareness of the consequences of some of the decisions they're making and factoring that into their long-term planning. There's another set of problems, though, for the people who are part of the auto-enrolment generation, because those people are arriving at retirement with pot sizes which are small, relatively speaking, compared to the past, but where actually they're still very, very valuable, because the industry tends to think about the attractiveness of a customer in terms of the scale of their investment assets. If you think about it, though, more through the eyes of the saver, back to the state pension, they know they're going to get a state pension of X. If they've got a retirement pot that can add 20% to X, that could be life-changing for them. In the industry's sense, it means nothing. You know, the pot might only be £40,000 or £50,000, which feels like, oh, just take it in cash, you know. What we have now to do is to find ways to deliver solutions that work for people who are looking for that 20% extra on their state pension, but to have it for 20 or 30 years. And those solutions aren't around yet. The ideas are there about how you deliver those now, but nobody's building them yet. And that's the thing we have to, I mean, it's another aspect of the policy that's going to have to be looked at.